Good afternoon. Welcome to the third lecture of the Lou Douglas Lecture Series for 1993. My name is Brent Coverdell. I'm an intern with the lecture program. I'd like to take this moment to make a few introductions and recognize a few people. First of all, we'd like to recognize Mary Douglas, who's the wife of Dr. Lou Douglas, on who this lecture series is honored. And I'd also like to take a minute to recognize all of the committee members for the Lou Douglas Lecture Series who make this series possible. If you'd please stand. Immediately after the lecture today, we're going to have a reception after the question and answer period. And also, we'd like to remind you of the next lecture. It's going to take place on Monday, November 8th at 7:30 p.m. It's going to be Dr. Ved Nanda, and his lecture is entitled Ethnic Conflicts and the World Order. So that promises to be a good one as well. Now I'd like to introduce someone, 1973 graduate from Kansas State University with a Bachelor of Science in History and Secondary Education. Also a 1985 graduate of the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary with a Master of Divinity. In his career, he has been a campus minister with United Campus Ministry of Oregon State, a pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Odessa, Missouri, and since 1987 has served at the Ecumenical Campus Ministry with Kansas State. He has been a man of great service to the community and to the campus. He has served as coordinator of the Manhattan Crop Walk. Also, he has been on the KSU Black History Month Planning Committee and has also served as a member of the KSU Native American History Month Planning Committee. Currently, he is serving as chair of the Church and Society Committee of the Presbytery of Northern Kansas. He is also a member of the State Board of Directors for Kansas Interfaith and Impact. He is also a member of the Planning Committee for the Manhattan Community Celebration of Martin Luther King Week. He's also a member of the Board of Directors for the Manhattan Alliance of Peace and Justice. And last but not least, he is also the chair of the Lou Douglas Lecture Committee. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Reverend Alvin L. Zimmerman, Jr.
Welcome to all of you who have come this afternoon. We're glad that you're here. You know, a state may be oppressive or a state may be liberating. Religion may be oppressive or religion may be liberating. But when religion and the state are not kept separate, the result is invariably oppressive. Our speaker, Dr. John Swomley, has recognized that fact, and much of his career has been spent in stressing the importance of the separation of church and state. In light of Pat Robertson's remarks this morning about religion, our country, our government, and Christianity, Dr. Swomley will address the issues of church and state, politics, and religion. He comes with excellent credentials to do so. Dr. Swomley has an undergraduate degree from Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, a Master of Arts and a Master of Divinity from Boston University, and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Colorado. He's an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church and a member of the Kansas East Conference of that denomination. He taught for 26 years as professor of social ethics at the St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City. He's also taught overseas as a visiting professor of social ethics at graduate schools in Buenos Aires, in the Philippines, and in a black college near Salisbury, Rhodesia during the guerrilla war. He has led an active life in service for promotion of human rights, religious freedom, peace, and justice. Following World War II, Dr. Swomley organized the Committee Against Jim Crow in Military Service and Training, which led to the desegregation of our armed forces. He has served as Executive Secretary of the Fellowship of Reconciliation from 1953 to 1960, and during that time he worked with the Reverend Martin Luther King. During the Montgomery bus boycott, he provided staffing service, and he helped to lead Dr. Martin Luther King to his stance on nonviolence. He served on the national board of the American Civil Liberties Union since 1970 and is currently the chair of the Church and State Committee of that organization. He is on the state board of the Missouri Family Health Council. He is currently president of Americans for Religious Liberty. He's also the book review editor of Christian Social Action, the associate editor of Human Quest, and the editor of Facts for Action, a newsletter on current events. He's the author of 8 books, including Religious Liberty in the Secular State, the Constitutional Context, and Religion, the State, and the Schools. He has published more than 225 articles in various periodicals. He's received many awards, among which are the 1985 Pioneer Humanist Award from the American Humanist Association, in 1975 the ACLU's Malin Award for outstanding service to the cause of civil liberties in Missouri and Greater Kansas City, and in 1976 was named Kansas City's World Citizen of the Year by the Mayor's United Nations Day Committee. In 1986, he received the Human Rights Award from the Ethnic Minority Student Coalition, St. Paul's School of Theology. And in 1984, the Kansas East Conference of the United Methodist Church began awarding an annual Swomley Scholarship to the St. Paul student who has demonstrated excellence in peace action and studies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. John Swomley.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I came down with a touch of laryngitis before I left New York yesterday. This morning you heard a lecture from an extraordinary man by the name Pat Robertson, but whose real name is Marion Gordon Robertson. The reason I call him an extraordinary man is that before coming to Manhattan, I decided to read 3 of his books. In one of them, entitled Beyond Reason, he claims miraculous powers. One miracle involved a hurricane bearing down at 150 miles per hour on his Christian Broadcasting Network radio and TV tower in Virginia Beach. And I quote from him, specifically, "I commanded that storm in the name of Jesus to stop its forward movement and to head back where it came from. After I left the prayer meeting," which is where he did the commanding, "after I left the prayer meeting at noon, I turned on my car radio. A bulletin on the national news had reported that the forward progress of Hurricane Betsy had been stopped at 10:30 a.m., the precise time that he issued the order." I continue to quote, "Since that time, not one single hurricane has returned to the region." Now, this raised some questions in my mind. Both, if Pat does have a pipeline to God, why doesn't he stop hurricanes that kill and maim and destroy the property of hundreds of thousands of people, instead of simply protecting his CBN empire? Another question that came to my mind was, does Pat really have miraculous powers, or is he lying? The book jacket of that book said that he saw combat duty in the Marine Corps in Korea. But during his political campaign for president, the press reported that he had a desk job in Japan during the war, with allegations that his father intervened to keep him from combat duty. The jacket of the book described him as a graduate of New York Theological School. But since I was in New York, I phoned the school registrar and asked if he actually graduated from that school, and the answer was no. He graduated from the old Bible school called the Biblical Seminary in New York in 1959, before the New York Theological School actually came into existence as a particular entity. Now, I also had a difficulty changing my plane ticket, so I went early to the plane yesterday and asked to stand by. And on my way into the airport, I thought the plane might be full, so I commanded the plane in the name of the ACLU to provide me with a spare seat. And when I got there, I found more than 30 spare seats. So I concluded that this was not the doing of the ACLU, this was mere coincidence. And then I thought I would try, because they told me that the plane from Chicago to Kansas City was completely sold out. I decided to use a miracle man, so I commanded the plane in the name of Pat Robertson to provide me with a seat. And when I got on the plane, I discovered that it hadn't been sold out. There were more than 20 seats left. Well, you know, one of the difficulties about miracles is that unless they are repeatable, you can't be sure that it was anything other than coincidence. A scientific definition of a miracle is something which succeeds, which had only a 10% chance of success. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus didn't claim these miraculous powers. If you read it carefully, and the only ones that can be verified, according to many New Testament scholars, are the psychological ones, the healing ones. Each time he said, "Thy faith has made thee whole." He did not claim that he did it. Now, no reputable theological school today would teach what Pat Robertson wrote in his book. I'm going to quote. He said, "God can cause us to be preferred and chosen above others of equal talent. He can protect our children. He can guard our property. He can cause his angels to aid us." I'm continuing to quote. "How well I remember the day in the late 60s when God showed forth his favor in my life in a practical workaday manner. CBN was in urgent need of $3 million worth of modern equipment. In the most remarkable yet smooth and calm manner, I received total favor from this giant company and arranged for our equipment needs to be met for a period of years at the finest terms imaginable. You see, God had let his face shine upon us and be gracious to us. We had favor with him in the invisible world." Now, unlike this morning when Pat denied certain quotations that students had actually heard, I have the exact reference to these things from his book, which he cannot deny. This one is from page 60 to 61 in another book called The Secret Kingdom. However, we must not be misled by these messianic claims to have divine support for his capitalist business enterprise. He's a very dangerous man. And when I speak about a capitalist business enterprise, he had many quotations in there indicating that businessmen had received remarkable millions, but that they then gave God a share in it, presumably a tenth, and that they could speak of God as co-partners of a capitalist enterprise. Now, there is nothing remotely like that in the New Testament. Instead, God speaks to the rich young ruler and tells him to give up all that he has. And he is primarily concerned with poverty and with helping the poor and helping those who have been unjustly treated. Now, this morning, you also heard that faith in God is essential to democracy. I should add, it is also essential to theocracy and to the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Inquisition. The trouble is that almost everyone uses the word God to identify with his or her particular organization or image of God. The Ku Klux Klan God, for example, is white, male, uneducated, and intolerant. The American Legion God is an American with a military slant and believes in conscription. The feminist God is a woman, and one could go on to describe how people read God into their own particular predilections. Now, Pat Robertson cannot speak without vilifying the ACLU, because that is the group that has had the most success legally with the Supreme Court. And I could hardly believe my ears when he said that his organization, which he created in order to fight the ACLU, it even parallels it in name ACLJ instead of ACLU, it's American Center for Law and Justice, that his organization had not lost one case in 3 years to the ACLU. Now, in the first place, that's a lie. Now, the ACLU took the Lee versus Weissman case, which resulted in the ruling that prayers at graduation ceremonies would be state-sponsored in effect and could not be tolerated in American society. And then he cited other cases, some of which the ACLU and the ACLJ were on the same side, but he wouldn't admit that. The ACLU has been in every free exercise case that ever went to the Supreme Court. And it's a remarkable way in which we can apprise that situation. He also spoke of Nathan Sharansky as a child of God, I am free, and spoke of him as a champion of liberty. But I do not recall his championing the cause of Palestinians after he got to Israel. He spoke of separation of church and state is not only to protect, he said it was to protect religion from the state. But the way that was written in the Constitution is that it is to protect the state also from religious entanglement. Pat Robertson concentrates on the free exercise clause, but he does not concentrate on the establishment clause, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, an establishment of religion is one where the state sponsors, supports, or otherwise aids a religious establishment or a church or any kind of religious organization. And one thing that has happened is that the Supreme Court has again and again indicated that the United States government, nor any state or city or school board, may actually write or sponsor or promote prayer in the public schools. It's the only way in a society such as ours, where we have Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and others in various places, plus Christians, to operate. I can well remember the first time I testified before a Missouri State Legislative Committee when a young woman came in and told that hearing that she had gone to a school in Missouri and that she was Jewish, and that she either had to go out in front of the class every morning when there were prayers, or she had to sit there and have prayers to a Christian God and to sometimes degrading her own religious faith. And then she broke into tears and indicated that she did not want this to happen to anybody else. Pat Robertson doesn't tell that kind of anecdote, but those are very real. He indicated we minister to 2,000 homosexuals every month. Probably what he meant was talking about them over the Christian Broadcasting Network, because he doesn't have the staff to have counselors who deal with that many persons, whether homosexual or not. Now, he spoke of crime in the public schools, and I know that there is crime in the public schools, but he concealed from you something that happened in his hometown of Virginia Beach. And if you want to verify this, it was in the January issue of Atlantic Monthly of this year. An Afro-American student who had been called nigger by his fellow students and had been ostracized by some of them and persecuted, brought an automatic gun to the school one day. And then he shot and killed one of his teachers and shot and seriously wounded another. And if another teacher hadn't done a flying tackle on him, he would have destroyed a number of students. Crime is not something to be identified with the public school. It can happen, as it did there in the Atlantic Christian Baptist Church School. It can happen any place in the United States where there's no gun control and where people can get guns whenever they want to and get revenge. And this man, using Pat Robertson's theology, after he was arrested, said, if God hadn't let those people call me those names and do those things to me, this wouldn't have happened. Now, I think we have to look at both the theological aspect as well as the political aspect. Marion Gordon Robertson is a former Baptist minister who gave up his credentials for political power. His immediate goal is to capture control of the Republican Party. His ultimate aim is to establish a theocratic rule over the United States which looks alarmingly like Christian fascism. Now, when I say that, I do not say it lightly, because I'm not sure exactly where Pat Robertson would come down on many issues. But the reason I mention it is that Robertson, like Hitler, has built his movement on other people's fears and hates. Hitler, of course, used the communists, but he also used homosexuals. And Hitler also spoke of leftists and Jews. Now, Pat Robertson's chief targets are not Jews, but homosexuals, leftists, feminists, and civil libertarians. Hitler merged religion with German nationalism and militarism and established an official church which backed both nationalism and militarism. Robertson merges his religion with nationalism and militarism in what he calls the Christian coalition, and makes it clear that he intends to establish an official religion, what he calls a Christian nation. He has already established a legal foundation and legal aspects to do this. Another fascist dictator, Mussolini, as well as Hitler, both of them moved their nations away from pluralism and diversity toward greater concentration and power and wealth into a repressive and vicious government with a big business partnership known as corporatism. Robertson is already describing some of his opponents as socialists and himself as a defender of capitalism. Robertson has done something very interesting, which I think we ought to note. In spite of the way he answered the question about the dictator Rios Montt this morning, he has identified General Rios Montt of Guatemala as the closest thing to a working model of what he wants to do. Now, Rios Montt was a military dictator who waged a brutal campaign that slaughtered as many as 10,000 Guatemalan citizens. A pastor from El Verbo, the complete word Pentecostal sect in which Rios Montt was a leader, justified the slaughter with these words, and I quote, "The army doesn't massacre the Indians, it massacres demons. And the Indians are demon-possessed. They are communists. We hold Brother Ephraim Rios Montt like King David of the Old Testament. He is the king of the New Testament," end of quote. Now, Robertson, in one of his recent books, by the way, he doesn't write these books. He has a co-author. He makes his notes and then he goes through and decides that he approves of what the co-author writes from his notes. You can find this on the book jacket on two of his books and in another place in a slight footnote. And recently someone handed me something from Newsweek indicating that one of his most recent co-writers was gay. I'll read you this. This is The Gay Ghost. Los Angeles writer Mel White ghosted books for Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and Billy Graham. What the evangelists didn't know then was that their ghost is gay. When White came to his former clients a year ago, Roberts urged him to get therapy. Instead, White decided to fight back with his own evangelical fire. As the new dean of the Cathedral of Hope, a gay congregation in Dallas, White plans to use the pulpit to rally gays against the religious right. They're only interested in raising money, he says, and rallying their constituents around easy targets, us. So far, the evangelists have turned the other cheek. Now, I mention this business of ghostwriting so that you would know that when Pat Robertson signs his name on it, this means that he thinks of the book as his own, as the credit to the other person is very small type. Now, Robertson, in his book, The New World Order, praised, quote, the enlightened leadership of former President Rios Montt. Robertson, that's end of quote. Robertson, like the Guatemalan pastor, sees demons everywhere. I quote, the human potential movement, he described, quote, as if part of a continuum, it invariably leads to psychic power, and occult power leads straight to demonic power, and these lead in turn to a single source of evil identified by the Bible as Satan. Among those, that's the end of that quote, among those Robertson considers as demons are the thousands of women who think of themselves as feminists. In the summer of 1992, Marion Gordon Robertson signed a fundraising letter that referred to an equal rights amendment proposed for the Iowa Constitution. In it he said, and I quote, the feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It is about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. End of quote. Recently, some of the people who are now heading up the political wing of his Christian coalition have urged him to be more moderate in his statements and not to do and say the things that he has been saying and writing. And you have an illustration of it this morning. He was relatively moderate, even though inaccurate. Now, the further thing is that Pat Robertson and his colleagues not only see demons, but he is also accumulated enough power, I'm told, to get corporate and wealthy backing to persuade a prominent senator woman from this state to encourage his coming to the Landon lecture, even though she knows that his aim is to take control of the Republican Party. As recently as May 15, 1992, he said concerning such groups as the ACLU and the National Council of Churches, though they're very much not alike, the National Council of Churches, you know, represents such mainstream churches as Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, United Church of Christ, and various others. And this is his quotation. The strategy against the American radical left, meaning those groups, should be the same as General Douglas MacArthur employed against the Japanese in the Pacific. Bypass their strongholds, then surround them, isolate them, bombard them, then blast the individuals out of their power bunkers with hand-to-hand combat. The battle to regain the soul of America won't be pleasant, but we will win it. End of quote. Now, what Marion Gordon Robertson didn't admit, even if he knew it, is that General MacArthur asked Roger Baldwin, the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, and at that time still a leader in it, and Charles Eigelhart, a professor at Union Theological Seminary, to come to Japan to help him with the draft of the Japanese Constitution, which incorporates separation of church and state. Robertson's method of seeking power over this country is based on his theology about the approaching end of the world, in which his brand of Christians will be protected by God, and in the struggle with groups he considers evil, he and his followers will emerge triumphant as leaders of the kingdom of God on earth. Accordingly, he changed the name of the university founded in Virginia to Regents University. And he explained this as follows. A regent is one who governs in the absence of a sovereign. End of quote. Now, his university, which plans to train graduate students in law, religion, communications, and education, is now engaged in training students, and I quote again, to rule and reign until Jesus the sovereign returns. Now, if they're ruling in the place of Jesus, and if Pat expects Jesus then to rule and dominate the world, counter to what we see in the New Testament, then here's a very clear indication of his theocratic instincts. Robertson's method of seeking power over this country and leads also to his effort to help other right-wing enterprises get started. Now, one of them is one that's been in existence for some time. His 700 Club Talk News program is on his private, for-profit family channel broadcast on almost 10,000 cable systems and reaching some 55 million homes. So whatever you may think about some of his views, he cannot be lightly dismissed. Second, the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN. Third, Standard News, a secular news bureau with ties to Reuters, which is aired on more than 400 radio stations. You may recall that he tried to buy United Press when it was going bankrupt. A different version of the news that he gets from Reuters is distributed to so-called Christian stations. Fourth, the political agent through which he works is the Christian Coalition, which in its day-to-day operations is run by its director, Ralph Reed, and its national field director, Guy Rogers. There are also regional directors, one of which is his son, Gordon. For a guy who claims to be a Christian, Pat Robertson uses tactics more akin to the CIA or some other form of covert action. In San Diego County, for example, he tried to get control of the Republican Party and then ran 90 candidates for such offices as school board, hospital board, and town council. The decision was made strategically that since he didn't make it in the presidency, that he would try to get control from the grassroots up all across the country. 60 coalition candidates won, most of them unknown persons who did no campaigning in a field where there were various other candidates. They won by what is known as a stealth process. That process included Christian family values endorsements distributed by anti-abortion groups in fundamentalist and evangelical churches on the Sunday before the Tuesday election, and then a massive telephone solicitation of previously identified sympathizers. Now, there's nothing illegal about this, but it is deceptive in that nobody tells his views as a candidate to the press or over the radio. And people who have never before been in politics, maybe never done anything outside of running a butcher shop or a baker shop, suddenly become school board members. Later in Robertson's home area, Virginia Beach, Christian Coalition members conducted telephone voter surveys to find out attitudes on abortion, party preference, schools, taxes, etc. Potential supporters were put in a computerized voter file. Since only 28% were anti-abortion, the pro-choice Republicans got letters which omitted the candidates' anti-abortion views and used some other device to gain support. Voter guides were hand-distributed, labeling candidates by such phrases as, quote, opposes abortion on demand, opposes homosexual rights, opposes condom distribution in schools, and supports voluntary school prayer method. Again, the stealth idea worked. Coalition leader Ralph Reed said of those who disagreed with, such as Democrats, quote, we don't want to communicate with them. We don't even want them to know there's an election going on. I'm serious. We don't want them to know, end of quote. On another occasion, Coalition Director Ralph Reed said, quote, I want to be invisible. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know it's over until you're in a body bag. You don't know until election night, end of quote. In short, Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition wins by deception, stealth tactics, and secret war against fellow Christians and Jews. We turn now to a look at the ideology of Robertson and his cohorts. They are motivated not only by power, but by selective biblical interpretation. Although they claim they believe in the inerrancy of the Bible and place equal weight on the Mosaic Law and other accounts in the Old Testament, they do not follow all of the Mosaic Law. For example, they do not follow dietary laws against eating pork or rabbit as prohibited by the Mosaic Law. Nor do they follow Leviticus 19, which forbids the wearing of a garment of cloth made of two different kinds of cloth, because many of them wear one made of nylon and wool, or nylon or some other fabric and cotton. Instead, they follow their prejudices and quote passages from Leviticus 20 which indicate that males caught in a homosexual act shall be put to death. Now what it says there, though the Bible knows nothing about homosexuality, is that if a male lies with another male as instead of lying as he should with a woman, then he will be put to death. Now, the Apostle Paul also condemns homosexual acts along with malice, murder, strife, and deceit, and adds that those who do such things deserve to die. However, Robertson and colleagues do not accept Paul's statement in the very next chapter, quote, "Never take vengeance into your own hands. Stand back and let God punish if he will." End of quote. Now actually, I don't know how many of you are biblically literate, but if you read the Bible carefully, you will never discover any episode where anybody who engaged in what Pat Robertson calls homosexual relations was ever killed. The Bible can be read in various ways. Most mainline churches do not subscribe to the Mosaic Code. That was written for a period of time and for a specific group of people. Instead, they look to what they speak of as biblical revelation. Although it says in the Bible, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a life for a life, in the book of Genesis, when Cain killed Abel, it says that God decided not to kill him or punish him, but to put a mark on his forehead so nobody else would kill him. Hosea could have killed an unfaithful wife. That was the law in those days. Instead, he chose not to. The woman caught in adultery could have been stoned, and they were starting to do it when Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." He took a step against the death penalty. And the most decisive thing is in a book that I don't know whether Robertson has read or not, Philemon, toward the end of the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul is put in jail with a slave owner. And he converted this guy to Christianity, or to his version of it anyhow. And then, lo and behold, the guy was released, and the runaway slave of this guy was put in prison with Paul. And Paul wrote the slave owner and said, "I could command you as a Christian not to," this is a paraphrase, but that first part isn't, "not to inflict the death penalty." And then he went on to say, "But instead I entreat you as a brother in Christ." Now, when you read the Bible, if you do, you have to read it with some intelligence. You don't accept every little thing as if it is absolutely true. For example, in the book of Genesis, there are at least 2 creation stories, and there's another one later in the Bible. But in one, God created vegetables or vegetation and plants and trees before he created the sun. Now, is this scientific? But Pat believes in scientific creationism being taught in the public schools instead of evolution. One has to be very careful what one does with biblical references. Now let me say a further word about homosexuality and the gay and lesbian situation. I commend to you a magazine called The Sciences. In its March-April issue, there's an important article which says that at least 1 out of every 20 babies born in the United States and presumably elsewhere are born without explicit sex organs that would identify them as either male or female, and that physicians have to do something at that point to make them one or the other. I say that because when I mention this Genesis business, it says that God created them male and female. Well, suppose it's true that God is creating people who could move either direction, and that bisexuality and homosexuality may not be something that's conjured up in the mind of a person later on in life. You know, Martin Luther, who was a theologian of his day, said that there are orders of creation, and he named some. But suppose that sexuality is an order of creation. Are we going to then validate from some obscure reference in the Old Testament or New Testament the idea that these people should not be able to live a lifestyle in the way that heterosexuals have a lifestyle and live it? You know, the ACLU has adopted a statement which says that it's not the government's business to go into the bedroom and look at what's going on. After all, there's something in the Constitution against no search and seizures without probable cause. But also, the ACLU has a position that the government should not interfere with the sex activities of consenting adults in private. And how else can you interfere with that unless you establish a totalitarian state and you do invade houses and bedrooms to find out what people are doing? My own convictions, based partly on religion and partly on just plain human sense, is that everybody, no matter what his lifestyle, is to be treated with respect and dignity. Now, Pat said that God loves sinners. Well, Apostle Paul said all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody's a sinner in that sense. But does God justify the lifestyle of homosexuals? Pat Robertson says no. Does he justify the lifestyle of everybody else? I would doubt it. Not if. But how do I know? Because I have never seen God. God has never disclosed himself to me about homosexuality or abortion or anything else. Now, let me say a word about sodomy, because Pat has on occasion spoken of sodomizers. If you read the passage in the Old Testament carefully, you will discover that the problem in Sodom was not what we speak of today as sodomy. The earliest commentaries or references to the Sodom legend do not link homosexuality to Sodom. In Jeremiah 23, the reference to Sodom is adultery. In Ezekiel, it's to Sodom's inhabitants as guilty of pride, surfeit of food, and prosperous ease, for they did not aid the poor and needy. Zephaniah 2 refers only to pride. The only reference to Sodom in the Gospels is one of Jesus, where when sending out his disciples to the countryside to visit people in the towns, he said, "But if, quote, they do not receive you, it shall be more tolerable on that day for Sodom than for that town." Now, the problem of Sodom was inhospitality to strangers. And when two strangers, whom in the Old Testament are called angels, went into Sodom, the men of Sodom wanted to rape them. They didn't ask for homosexual consensual relationships. They appeared at the door of the house or tent where Abraham was sheltering these two people and said they wanted to know him. And Abraham didn't think of them as having any particular orientation because he offered them his two daughters to appease them so that they wouldn't attack these strangers. And his two daughters, whom he offered, were not yet married, but were engaged to be married to two of the inhabitants of Sodom, who presumably were out there. So you have no reference whatever to homosexuality in any consensual relationship in Sodom. It was to mass rape, which can happen at a tailhook assembly of the Navy. It can happen in the military. It can happen in prison. And I've had colleagues who have been in prison who have watched or have tried to stop these massive rapes by heterosexuals. So we must be very careful about biblical interpretation. And then Pat Robertson and his Christian Coalition are strongly anti-abortion, which is not at all biblical. In Numbers 5, Moses said that the Lord actually prescribed the mixing of a potion by the priest that under certain circumstances would cause an abortion. Now, I don't subscribe to that as any indication that God approves of abortion or disapproves of anything. But Moses thought that God did. And it was the case of a man, because it was a man's world, being jealous of his wife, whom he thought was having some friendship or relation with other men. And so they had a trial by ordeal. The priest would mix the potion, give it to the woman in a liquid, and if her thighs would swell, and you know in the Bible, the word "no" is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. And when they speak of the thighs or the belly or something swelling, it's a euphemism for either a child coming down or the like. And if the woman had been guilty, then she would have a psychological effect and the fetus would be aborted. But I've never met a fundamentalist who would refer to that or acknowledge that it's even in the Bible. Now, Pat Robertson's prejudice against women makes him advocate compulsory pregnancy. If a woman, through ignorance or a failed contraceptive or rape or incest, becomes pregnant. Although abortion was widely practiced during New Testament times, Jesus and no one else in the Scriptures ever mentioned a prohibition against it. And part of the reason is that Judaism, even to this day, thinks that the woman takes precedence over anything that the woman carries. In fact, the whole idea that at the moment of conception a human being exists is alien to the Scriptures. The Hebrew word for a human being or person is nephesh, which means the breathing one. And 167 scientists, and including 11 Nobel Prize winners in this, submitted a brief to the Supreme Court in which they said you cannot speak of a human being before the development of lungs and kidneys. Breathing is essential. And some other scientists then indicate that the brain is what it is that differentiates human beings and persons from all other kinds of life, and that doesn't develop or begin to develop until about the 28th week of pregnancy. Now, I've taught biomedical ethics. I didn't give him all of that what he read, but I do know that the biologists today who study these things indicate that when there's conception, it does not take place in a moment. Conception takes a period of time. You can't tell whether there's conception until there's implantation in the uterus, which takes perhaps 10 days to 2 weeks. And that means that nobody knows that there's conception until after that. But one of the important studies that was made by a neurobiologist is Michael Gardner. And he not only says it's misleading to speak of a moment of conception, he says that, and he did his doctoral research on the genetic control of brain development at the University of Michigan's Medical School, Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology. He said the biological argument that a human being is created at fertilization comes as a surprise to most embryologists, for it contradicts all that they have learned in the past few decades. And then he notes that in humans, when two sibling embryos combine into one, the resultant person may be completely normal. If the two original embryos were determined to become particular individuals, such a thing could not happen. The embryos would recognize themselves to be different and would not unite. But here the cells seem unaware of any distinction between themselves. The only explanation is that the individual is not fixed or determined at this stage. And then he goes on to say, and I quote, "The fertilized egg is clearly not a prepackaged human being. Our genes give us a propensity for certain characteristics, but it is the enactment of the complex process of development that gives us our individual characteristics. So how can an embryo be a human being?" And he further states, quote, "The information required to make an eye or a finger does not exist in the fertilized egg. It exists in the positions and interactions of cells and molecules that will be formed at a later time." You see, it's important to recognize that religion need not differ from science. It is only when religion goes back to certain biblical verses that were written centuries and thousands of years ago, as if they are now modern science, that we run into grave trouble. Now, let me go on with one or two other items here before I close. Pat Robertson is against separation of church and state because he wants a Christian theocracy, rather than a pluralist society in which Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, humanists, and atheists have equal rights. I don't know whether you know that the largest growing denomination in this country today are Muslims. They exceed in number the Episcopalians, they exceed in number the Presbyterians. These would be disenfranchised in a Christian theocracy. And there are also Buddhists who are growing, not only in Hawaii, but in California and in other parts of this country. Instead of accepting Article 6, Section 3 of the United States Constitution, which says, quote, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, Robertson wants a government to be run by fundamentalist or evangelical Christians who accept his goals and beliefs. Incidentally, when he speaks of Christians, he does not speak of some of you and of myself as a Christian. He speaks in terms of fundamentalist and evangelical Christians as genuine Christians. Now, since he is an Old Testament Christian who wants government sponsorship of religion, provided it is his religion and not Judaism or Catholicism or something else, he therefore wants prayer and worship services in the public schools. His followers use various arguments for this. One used by Jesse Helms, a friend of Pat Robertson, is that when God and prayer were taken out of the schools, crime and violence increased. We should remember that the Ku Klux Klan opens every meeting with prayer and is one of the sources of violence against people they dislike. Actually, those who believe that God is a spirit or a non-physical presence everywhere would have difficulty with the idea that the absence of government-sponsored prayer removed God from any place. Of course, Robertson and his followers are mistaken. The Supreme Court did not ban voluntary private prayer. All it banned was government sponsorship of public religious services in the public schools or in other public settings where the state would be assumed to be sponsoring this. I view this as leaving religious expression to the family, the individual, the church, the synagogue, the mosque, rather than imposing a state-sponsored religion on non-believers. The idea that student groups or student prayers at graduation or student-led prayers in the classroom are okay, which is what Pat Robertson's ACLJ are trying to get in the courts. That idea means that classrooms and commencement prayers at exercises at graduation would be open to evangelical and fundamentalist sermons by students trained to use prayer as the technique for proselytizing. Actually, Robertson and the Christian Coalition have little respect for public education. They prefer Christian schools subsidized by the state. They, and I'm sorry to say the Catholic bishops, use the phrase parental choice to advocate vouchers. And Pat strongly endorsed vouchers for private schools this morning. In California, at this moment, a voucher proposal in the form of a referendum to be voted on in November would provide $2,600 from the public school budget for every student in parochial or Christian schools, and that amount would further deplete the money available for public education, in effect destroying an already underfinanced public school system. And in the law, or in the proposal that has been written, any sect or cult that collects 25 children could qualify for the vouchers and be subsidized by the general public. Such schools could segregate people on the basis of religion, as well as race, gender, or anything else. Now, it says that they won't segregate by race, but there's nothing in there that provides that if you can get a voucher from the public school system, that the private school will accept you. They have disciplinary, they have educational qualifications and other things that they can use against anybody. And as you may know, these schools have a history of dismissing teachers and students without due process of law, which is required in the public schools, simply because, in one parochial school, a school teacher who was a Catholic, married a Methodist, and had a child baptized in the Methodist Church, dismissed immediately. Or a Catholic woman whose daughter was in the school and who did not attend Mass regularly, was dismissed, and the child was dismissed. So there's no protection in any private school, either on the grounds of religion or race or anything else. Now I want to close with one item here, and then, or with two items first. I think there's a danger in political parties that have become, in effect, religious parties. We have a long history of this in the history of the world. In Germany, it was the Christian Democrats, founded by the papacy at the end of World War II when there was apparent chaos, in order to provide some cohesion politically for uniting Europe. But it was the Christian Democratic Party that rearmed Nazi Germany against the will of the people. It was the Christian Democratic Party under a different name in France that began the war in Vietnam that we got involved in. The Christian Democratic Party in El Salvador that we subsidized and that was involved in a lot of the chicanery that happened down there. The problem here is that no political party can really be Christian. For one reason, any political party in a democracy has to learn to compromise. And theocratic parties do not compromise with what they think is evil. Furthermore, while it's possible to exclude people from a church who do not believe in the church's program, the Christian political party would also make a heresy, a Christian heresy, out of people who didn't accept the political program of the party. The Christian coalition presumes some continuity between its narrow views on sex, economics, taxes, schools, women, gays and lesbians, and the kingdom of God, as if such a political program is Christian and the basis for the kingdom of God. And what it means is that obedience to a party is obedience to God, and rules out the possibility that people can obey God in different ways. A Christian coalition looks to the past that characterizes a Christian nation, back into the Old Testament and to some degree in the New. But the kingdom of God doesn't accept racial segregation, which was acceptable to the Christians not only back in those days, but acceptable to the nation that we had at one time, which Pat Robertson romanticizes and glorifies. Think of what the Christian ministers in New England did to Roger Williams, drove him into exile, burned witches, forced Ann Hutchinson into exile. These are the ministers he talked about this morning. He wants to rule the nation. Look at the way Christians decimated the Indian population in this country. Look at the way it happened in South America. We can't go back to the past. We can't accept that definition, either of religion or of patriotism. Now, the Christian coalition does not believe that people can be converted voluntarily. They want to impose a Christian political structure on them. And if any religious groups seek power through legal or state control, I think it's doing so because they are too weak to persuade everybody else to accept their program, and they have to use coercion to prevent sins such as what they think is a sin, an abortion or homosexuality or something else. Now, I want to conclude with a bit of humor. I'm not going to tell you who wrote it, but it's biblical, at least in part. And Abraham awoke in the middle of the night and said to his only son Isaac, I have had a dream where the voice of the Lord saith that I must sacrifice my only son, so put your pants on. And Isaac trembled and said, so what did you say? I mean, when he brought this whole thing up. "What am I going to say?" Abraham said. "I'm standing there at 2 a.m. in my underwear with the creator of the universe. Should I argue?" "Well, did he say why he wants me sacrificed?" Isaac asked his father. But Abraham said, "The faithful do not question. Now let's go, because I have a heavy day tomorrow." And Sarah, who heard Abraham's plan, grew vexed and said, "How dost thou know it was the Lord, and not say thy friend who loveth practical jokes? For the Lord hateth practical jokes, and whosoever shall pull one shall be delivered into the hands of his enemies, whether they can pay the delivery charge or not." And Abraham answered, "Because I know it was the Lord." It was a deep, resonant voice, well modulated, and nobody in the desert can get a rumble in it like that. And Sarah said, "And thou art willing to carry out this senseless act?" But Abraham told her, "Frankly, yes, for to question the Lord's word is one of the worst things a person can do, particularly with the economy in the state it's in." So he took Isaac to a certain place and prepared to sacrifice him. But at the last minute, the Lord stayed Abraham's hand and said, "How could thou do such a thing?" And Abraham said, "But thou said." "Never mind what I said," the Lord spoke. "Dost thou listen to every crazy idea that comes thy way?" And Abraham grew ashamed and began to stutter. "Not really, no. I jokingly suggest thou sacrifice Isaac, and thou immediately runs out to do it." And Abraham fell to his knees. "See, I never know when you're kidding." And the Lord thundered, "No sense of humor? I can't believe it. But doth this not prove I love thee, that I was willing to donate mine only son on thy whim?" And the Lord said, "It proves that some men will follow any order, no matter how asinine, as long as it comes from a resonant, well-modulated voice." My concluding comment is that I like those bumper stickers which say, "Question authority." And I remember what Senator Fulbright said when he was asked what the biggest lesson he learned from the Vietnam War was. He said, "Never to trust the statements of the United States government." And I would add, the statements of some Christian organizations that want your votes.
Reception in the courtyard following the questions and answers, and we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you would raise your hand, please, we will recognize you for questions. Yes, one right there.
Yes, I have a question. What would you say to someone who says to you that unless you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, that you are not a Christian and not able to go to heaven? And by that I mean not God, but Jesus Christ.
Well, first of all,
Please repeat
the question is, what would I say to somebody, you check me if I'm right, who claims that a person is not a Christian unless he or she accepts Jesus Christ as his or her personal Savior? Let me say, first of all, that there are three types, sociological types of Christian organizations. One is the code of conduct measurement, which you have in some groups like the Mennonites, for example, where if you smoke or if you do certain things, I won't mention them all, you can't really be a Christian. It's determined by your code of conduct. The second type is what we speak of as the church type, as over against the sect type, the church type has a formula of words, which in I think every instance requires a statement to the effect that you believe in Jesus Christ as your personal Savior and so on. The third type of Christian organization is the kind of, I can't think of the term right now that is used sociologically, but I can illustrate it. It's the Society of Friends, or Quakers, where they have no code of conduct, they have no ritual expression that you have to say, but which thinks of God more or less as the inner voice, that there's a God within each person rather than someplace else. Now, having said that, let me say very quickly that the concept of heaven and hell are concepts which are pre-Copernican. The idea that there's a place up there and a place down here. Let me say quickly, when Pat Robertson talks about Satan, there is no Satan. The tendency to personify evil and personify goodness is something that involves a lot of people. Let's take hell, for example. If God is a loving and forgiving God, he could or she could not create an eternal torture chamber for people to suffer. Second, hell, however, is a condition. If anybody says to you, as some people have said to me, what I have done is so terrible that not even God could forgive me, that person has condemned him or herself to eternal torture, mentally, psychologically, and feels the punishment as everlasting punishment. So we don't get away from the problem of guilt. Now, one thing that the concept of forgiveness does is to help get rid of guilt. And the person who wronged, or who is wronged by this person who feels so terrible, can forgive that person and erase that guilt. Or a priest in the confessional can forgive that person and tell him to do such things and it'll be forgiven. Or you can pray directly to God to get that forgiveness. Now, the question, of course, is there a heaven? And I believe that heaven is here on earth. I believe that heaven is not a reward afterlife, which was so often used to convince slaves and poor people that they get shoes in heaven. All God's children get shoes, but you get them by and by. I believe that one can so live that life is a joyous, friendly, helpful thing to other people, as well as something that you enjoy yourself, and that you need not be guilt-ridden when you do something wrong or make a mistake, whatever it is. Now, that raises a question then, and I taught Christian ethics for many years. What happens? Is punishment, such as hell, or reward, such as heaven, the basis for living a Christian ethical life? What I told my students was that if you give a child an ice cream cone or some money for being good, or threaten that child with punishment for being bad and inflicting it, then the child is good because of the reward or punishment, but not good for goodness sake. That if the child wants to be good because he or she loves his parents or other people, that's being good for goodness sake. And I deplore this business of reward and punishment for now in the pre-Copernican period, people believed a lot of things that we don't believe today. And I think we simply have to ask ourselves what it is that is the essence of Christianity. Is it the pre-Copernican statements? Is it the Mosaic Law? Or is it something else? I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's where I'm coming from, if you
What is your name, sir?
It's all right, just call me you.
I want to be right about
Swomley, go ahead. John.
Well, anyhow, we believe there is a heaven and a hell.
Yeah.
That's all right about the clapping. That's okay, thank you. But what we believe is your heaven and your hell is right here on this earth. See, we call things what you call heaven right here on this earth.
Yeah.
Your heaven, your earthly heaven. Now we believe that your education is very important because that's next to your religion. You see what I mean? Because that allows you, with the job that you get, to be able to get the thing that you need here on this earth as far as friendship is concerned. Then after you die, then we let God take care of that. Because see, no one has never, if you had relatives that died, have never told you about a heaven when they about return to heaven after they have died. And as far as forgiveness is concerned, we say that forgiveness is more like I'll do an evil deed to you.
We need to have a question because we only have a. You have a question to ask.
Oh yeah. What about the Somalian situation? Somalian and the Palestinian. Now you have both there.
Okay. If you would give me a chance, I'll try to answer. Let me say, first of all, since there's one thing I should have said earlier, when Pat Robertson in his books talks about the second coming of Jesus, there are those Christians who believe the second coming was the resurrection. There are also those who do not believe that the second coming is in the form of a military Messiah who's going to make things right. It's going to be any different from that. Now about Somalia. I was opposed to the sending of troops into Somalia. And what you probably didn't get in your newspapers, because the newspapers don't always tell you the truth, they hide it, did appear in the Los Angeles Times, strangely. Los Angeles Times pointed out that when the first American troops landed, there was no place to receive them except the American compound of Conoco Oil Company. And that Conoco had maintained this huge guarded area, so that they were able to come in and, in effect, establish a beachhead. But then the Los Angeles Times went on to indicate that there were a number of other, Phillips Petroleum, and I forget, I think Standard Aramco and some others were there also. And that one of the functions of the occupation was to bring order back into the situation so that what they hadn't been able to do in terms of exploration and drilling would be able now to take place. The thing that George Bush told us was that this was necessary to provide food aid and water and so on. But it's interesting that one of the Somalian women who's into human rights indicated that they had enough agricultural sustenance there, that they didn't need to have an occupying force, and that the private organizations could come in and do it. Now, the problem is the warlords, but I think we're faced with essentially the same situation that we're faced with in former Yugoslavia. Does the United States think of itself as the world's policeman and want to go in and settle every wrong that's inflicted on other people? Much as I deplore what's going on, I think that any invasion of troops, unless invited by the people themselves for some good reason, a non-military reason basically, any invasion is going to be counterproductive. It will spread the war. It will cause eventually more suffering. It will unsettle the potential there, and so on. Now that happens to be my personal opinion, just as I gave you my personal opinion about heaven and hell. I don't expect you to accept it unless you want to.
I have a kind of observation and follow-up question. I teach here, and usually I'm listening to arguments and reasoning. There wasn't much of that this morning. There was a lot of information that is useful for you. But my observation is just about the tone of the two.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, my observation is about the tone of the two talks we've heard today, and that those of us who have been fortunate enough to hear you might be able to compare the tones of the two talks. It seems to me that what we heard this morning was that smooth, modulated voice, but there was so much hate behind it, exclusiveness, talk about we, when it's clear in the audience not everybody would agree with him. A lot of real ugliness in the tone of that. Now, you called him a liar today, but I didn't hear that same tone in what you were presenting to us. It did not have that same kind of oily ugliness.
What's the question now?
The question is, what is it that keeps so many people from being able to see through that smooth, modulated voice and to applaud him today when we've really benefited so much more from your being here? It doesn't have that same ugly quality to it. How is he fooling people with that voice?
Well, I don't know, to be honest with you. I think that I was somewhat pleasantly surprised by the presentation this morning. It was not quite as rapid as his writing. And of course, even in his writing, there are sections where you would find it unobjectionable. The problem is the hidden political agenda. And not so hidden when you have actual fights such as you're having in various parts of the United States over the question of whether people who are gay and lesbian can have the same rights as the rest of us have. Yes, there is a lot of hate and fear in that picture. I suppose that I feel more relaxed about the situation, even though I think we're in a dangerous situation, because I think the good sense of the American people can still be appealed to. And I think that people who recognize what's going on have to be out and vocal. For example, and I probably should have said this in my remarks, in Johnson County, Kansas, in the last election, the stealth program was put into effect. And they elected a considerable number of people and actually took nominal, at least control of the Republican Party. A very courageous Presbyterian minister named Bob Meneely, who has a congregation of 7,800 members. That'll be pretty good to do that. Preached a sermon warning the congregation about the religious right and its political goals, and talked about some of the, well, not exactly the same things I did, but from his perspective, some of the similar things. This was published in full in the Sun newspapers. The New York Times picked up a digest of it and put it on the op-ed page sometime back. All of this led to a coalition called together by the Jewish Community Relations Bureau. And I got an invitation to go, though I don't live in Kansas or in Johnson County, and I've been there to two meetings. There were Republicans and Democrats. There were people who had no great interest in political parties or anything of the sort. And they have formed an organization. I think it's, I've forgotten the name already, Coalition or something or other. And they intend to educate people in the course of the approaching election about the election, so that people in Johnson County are not caught again in this stealth buying. Now, the pastor of that church got the ACLU award a couple of years ago, and I presented it to him. When Pat Robertson talks about the ACLU being or against religion, it's malarkey, to put it mildly. The problem here is that Pat Robertson doesn't accept any kind of religious approach except his own. The Church-State Committee in the ACLU, of which I am the chair, has Jews and Catholics and Protestants and humanists on it. And we objectively look at the constitutional prohibitions. And we try to come out with something that is fair to all. No special privileges to anybody. And then an 80-member board debates our proposed policy and modifies it or sends it back to us. It's just like in the United States Congress. The ACLU is concerned that there be freedom of religion and freedom for people who are not religious as well in this country. Now, what we need to do is to organize, because school choice things, as Pat Robertson puts it, bans on homosexuals or whatever you want to call it, all of these things are going to happen in Kansas. And they're going to try to stuff school boards with their candidates. You should be able to know before an election what people stand for. They should be willing to be scrutinized and quizzed by the press. There was no press interview here, you noticed, today. The requests were made for it, but I don't know who made the decision that Pat Robertson wouldn't be interviewed by the press, find out some of the things he really believes. But everybody should be interviewed by the press who runs for office, so that we know where that person stands, so that we can vote intelligently. It's your job to see that these things happen, and that you form a coalition to educate us.
I first have a response to what you said earlier about Pat Robertson, about the hurricane situation.
Yes.
Well, it says in Ephesians chapter 4 that God has called people to be prophets, teachers, evangelists, and so that right there proves that prayer through God, that could happen, would happen. My question to you is, if you were to die today, where would you go?
I hope I would be cremated. Let me say further to you. One of the dangers of believing that if you pray to God for a change in the weather is that somebody else may be praying to God for a different change in the weather. You may want rain for your crops. They might want a fair sky for the baseball game or for something else, for a holiday. The idea that God is influenced by your selfish desires is, I think, in itself a problem. Why is it that there are earthquakes which nobody wants? Nobody has prayed for an earthquake unless they're malevolent. Does this mean that God is not in control of the universe? It's possible that he isn't. When he quoted Jefferson and Madison and other people this morning, are you listening? You asked a question. Do you want to hear what I'm saying, or do you want to converse with your fellows there about what I'm saying now? Jefferson was a deist. He believed in God, but a God who was like somebody who started things out as a clockmaker winds up a clock and then lets it go. There are different versions of this. And anybody who thinks that he or she can influence God for what he or she wants, as over against asking God, for example, to protect the poor and the unjust from both capitalism and communism, is not asking God for anything that you can expect God to answer. Because God sends the rain on the just and on the unjust. And there are many, many statements in the New Testament about aiding the poor. We cannot manipulate God. We cannot use magic, and prayer must not be magic. Now, I don't know whether we agree on that, but we probably don't. Now, let me say a word about prophecy. There are two definitions of prophecy. One is the foretelling of events, and the other one is the forthtelling. To people in power or to people in general of what they ought to be doing. The difference is, in the generalized statement, whatsoever you do, you shall reap. And in the business that if you do so-and-so, you're going to go to hell. Or you're going to do this or that, and that's going to happen. The Bible does not predict a battle of Armageddon in our century, or in any century. Pat Robertson believes in that. It does not predict that the nation of Israel will be formed just before that takes place. If the prophecy were really true, then the prophecy, instead of talking about lighting candles and using spears and bows and arrows, instead of electric lights and nuclear weapons, would be in the Bible. You see, there's nothing prophesying about our present-day situation, except in the most general terms. It's when you get into this position where, and Robertson does it, he says that in Ezekiel, it's prophesied that Gog and Magog, nations to the north of Israel, will come down and invade them. And then he, because he wrote this before the collapse of communism, he said the Soviet Union, Gog and Magog. Well, if he knows the mind of God, why did he say that? If he is a prophet, why did he say that? The danger is when we become the agents of God to the extent that we think we know everything that's going to happen, and we speak it out, and we find later on that it's wrong. When he predicted the end of the world once before and it didn't happen, he was wrong. I think he's still wrong.